Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Facing Project informational session. I am J.R. Jamison. I'm a co-founder of the Facing Project and currently serve as president of the organization. Today, we'll share a bit about the genesis of the Facing Project, why this all came together, how we've worked with communities and examples from past projects, and how you can bring the Facing Project to your campus and to your community. I have a couple of co-presenters with me here today, so I want them to introduce themselves, and then we'll hop back over into the session to talk about the origin story. Lauren, we can start with you.
Hi, my name is Lauren Instenes, and I am the leader of the Facing Intolerance project that happened in 2016. I'm also a past board chair on the Facing Project board. I'm happy to be here with everyone today.
Hi, my name is Kathy Rah. I'm a professor of sociology at Sinclair Community College in Dayton, Ohio. I've co-led one facing project on gun violence, and that project started in 2019. And then I led another facing project in 2023 on eviction. And I'm also a member of the Facing Project board.
Thank you both. I like to share for people who aren't familiar with where we are headquartered, which is in Muncie, Indiana, is that it's also the home of Bob Ross. So if you're familiar with the Joy of Painting television show that broadcast on PBS from 1983 to 1994, Bob Ross came into the living rooms of millions of people across the world to teach them how to paint in 30 minutes. Very easily, he had people watch his show and learn how to create these beautiful landscapes because Bob believed that regardless of what your background was, everyone had the ability to paint a picture, and he was going to show you how to do that. So in the spirit of Bob Ross, we talk about at the Facing Project that we believe everyone has the ability to be a storyteller and to talk about their lived experiences. But sometimes people need help on identifying kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And when I say end, I say that loosely because facing project stories don't always have a happy resolution like we're taught that stories should have. Sometimes they're still open because people are in the throes of what are happening to them. But we believe that everybody has the ability to learn how to share their story in a succinct way with others. And we also believe that writers out there have the ability to craft and write stories. A bit of the spirit of Bob Ross, too, is the resiliency of our community of Muncie, Indiana. And this is why we started the Facing Project back in 2012. I was a volunteer with an organization called Teamwork for Quality Living, which was a poverty-serving org in our community. It's now folded into what is called Second Harvest Food Bank. And Teamwork for Quality Living had what they called the Circles program. And the Circles program paired individuals who self-identified as being in poverty. They signed up to be in the program, and they were partnered with allies who would help them on goal setting based on what the individual, who we called captains, wanted to achieve. Sometimes that was helping figure out how to pay off debt and how to have conversations with debt collectors. Sometimes that was connecting them to resources in the community. It really varied depending on the captain in each circle. My co-founder, Kelsey Timmerman, was also involved in the Circles program. Both of us are educators, both of us are writers. I spent about almost 20 years of my career working in the campus compact world, working directly with faculty, staff, and college students who were community engaged citizens and learners. Being involved with Circles, there was a local economist who had written this op-ed about the poverty statistic in our community, which at that time was hovering around 43%, which if you know anything about poverty statistics, that's pretty high. That was partially because we are in the Rust Belt. We're a Rust Belt community, so many factories had closed by the late aughts, mostly due to automation. Some of it was because jobs did move elsewhere, but people did not leave the community. And jobs that they took on after they were laid off weren't necessarily paying the type of wages that they were receiving in their factory positions. So our poverty rate skyrocketed. But this economist argued that that statistic also included college students. And in his view, he didn't feel that college students should be included because he viewed them as being only in situational poverty. But being someone who was an educator and worked with college students who Some lived out of their cars while they went to school. I knew many who lived on couches so that they didn't have to pay for housing. I knew many college students who relied on financial aid, and many students who were first generational students, much like my story, who didn't necessarily have mentors who could help them understand the ropes of higher education. So this blanket statement or idea that no college students are really living in poverty, only situational poverty, and should be extracted from the data, didn't sit well with me as an educator or with my co-founder, Kelsey Timmerman. It also didn't sit well with Molly Flotter, who had started Teamwork for Quality Living. So we started having a conversation about how do we move beyond statistics, right? Statistics are important. They play an important role. But any good researcher will tell you that mixed methods is the best approach, marrying storytelling with statistics. So we said, how do we look at these stats and pull out each of those numbers and say, what is the story or lived experience behind this? So we can tell a full story of what poverty looks like in our community. And we got the idea of having folks who opted in, teaching them how to write their story about their lived experience around poverty. We had about 21 storytellers opt into this, but we quickly learned that not everyone had the ability to write their own story on the page. Some people had never learned to read or write. So we had to take a step back and say, how do we make this an equitable process so that everyone can share their story on the page? So then we got the idea, what if we partner a writer with a storyteller? They would work with the storyteller through a series of conversations, and they would write the story in the first person on the page as if they were with the storyteller being in control of that narrative. But we also didn't want anyone to feel left out or feel kind of awkward about having a storyteller and some people not. So we made the decision that everyone would have a story partner, a listening partner, regardless if you could write your story or not. This ended up becoming 42 people who were involved in producing 21 stories and facing poverty. We put together a stapled booklet. We shared them throughout our community as a resource to begin conversations to go deeper than just that statistic, to have a holistic conversation around what poverty looks like. And yes, that also includes college students and their lived experiences. And we also worked with our local theater to bring some of these stories to life on stage. Molly was really pleased with this work. It raised the profile of her organization. She received a $75,000 donation from a local bank because of the work that they did around collecting these narratives. And Kelsey and I kind of stepped back and said, as writers and educators, we felt like we helped do this thing that we're really proud of, but we now need to pivot back over into other parts of our life with full-time jobs and families and volunteer work. What we did not realize is that other nonprofits would reach out to us in our community and say, hey, we saw this project on poverty. We would love if you would help us do the same thing, but tell our stories on autism, tell our stories on addiction. So Kelsey and I talked about it and we said, okay, why not? That was kind of a cool and awesome experience. Let's do this. So we started to do that for about a year, year and a half. We were working on multiple different projects in our community, but it didn't really make sense, right? We had to step back at some point and say, do we have the capacity to do this? Does it make sense for us to be the ones leading all of these projects in our community and surrounding area? Or does it make better sense to train people on the process and allow them to have the goodwill to lead their own projects using the tools and materials that we've put together to use their own stories and narratives to create change? So in the summer of 2014, we started putting together a toolkit and a training model where we then reached out to people and we said, look, we will not lead this project for you, but we will lead you through the process to do your own facing project. And that's really when the facing project loosely started to come together. We did not formalize as a nonprofit organization until 2017. So there was about a 2.5 to 3 year period where we just existed as an organization. But we decided to formulate as a nonprofit in 2017 so that we can better work and expand the work that we're doing with communities. This is our mission that was developed by our board. We create a more understanding and empathetic world through stories that inspire action. And We do that through three main initiatives. The first, which is what we'll be talking mostly about today, is community-based facing projects, where steering committees and communities adopt our model and lead their own projects in their community. The Facing Project radio show, where we have a partnership with Indiana Public Radio and the broader NPR network to share stories from past facing projects and interview experts on topics as another way to disseminate stories from our communities to a broader audience. And then the Facing Project Press that we started in 2020 that provides a publishing outlet for Facing Project communities to publish their books and in partnership with Ingram Content Group, distribute those stories across their community into libraries and into bookstores. Since our loose founding in 2012 with the launch of Facing Poverty here in Muncie, that then grew into more of a formalized organization in 2016 and 2017, the Facing Project model has been used by over 100 different steering committees in 20 US states on almost every topic that you can imagine, and we'll hear some of those today. We've worked with over 3,500 writers who have been trained on our storytelling and writing approach. When you look at people who have either gotten a copy of the books, purchased a copy of the books, attended a listening circle, or attended a Facing Project event through all of these communities, we've indirectly impacted around 10 million people. And our radio show reaches 2.3 million listeners each week through broadcast and podcast. So we view this as a way to get these stories out to a broader audience, to get people talking about these topics and issues, and hopefully to expand empathy in deeper ways. Our model is pretty simple. So it's storytelling, it's writing, like I've talked about. Sometimes it includes that theatrical piece. We include that in the toolkit. Some communities do the theatrical piece, and we'll hear some from Lauren about that, and maybe a bit from Kathy. But some people choose not to do it, and that's okay. Really, it's focused on that storytelling and the writing and book publishing and using those stories to have conversations in your community. But really, number two is where we settle in on what this work really is, and that's listening. So every storyteller and writer who goes through the Facing Project is trained on our writing and storytelling process, and we put them through what we call empathy exchanges. That's an opportunity for the writer and storyteller to sit down together to build rapport in a really easy way through these empathy exchanges so that they can then go off and go deeper through a series of meetings over a 6-week period to develop that first draft of the story. And what we say to our storytelling teams, this really is an opportunity to listen and to carry a story on the page. It's not an opportunity for you to creatively insert yourself into that story. And it takes a lot of courage and skill to do that. But we believe that we do that by working with our storytelling pairs to train them appropriately on that process. So one part of our mission that I talked about earlier is stories that inspire action. And so to give a couple of examples of what that has looked like, we worked with Kansas State University a few years ago on a Facing Hunger project. It was led by college students at Kansas State University, along with a faculty mentor, Dr. Lori Niffen. And the students wanted to collect narratives as a way to help convince their administration that they needed a food pantry on campus. Up until that point, most faculty and staff who were not making a living wage would access the food pantry in the community. Students who were food insecure were also accessing the food pantry in the community. But again, that went back to that equity question. Was that taxing the food pantry in the community too much, or did it make better sense to have a resource on campus that faculty, staff, and students could access rather easily? So they use the Facing Project model as a way to collect these narratives of students, community members, and faculty and staff to tell their stories on food insecurity. About a year after their book project launch and discussions happened, a food pantry was developed on that campus. Was it 100% because of their Facing Project? No. But did the Facing Project influence the food pantry beginning? They say absolutely yes. Here in Indiana, we've done multiple projects on autism. Those books and stories have now been adopted by our state police, and they use those books and stories in training with their officers. Sometimes stories are a source of healing or inspiration, and there may not be that tangible piece just yet. A couple of examples. So a project that's hot off the presses is Facing Recovery that happened here in my hometown of Muncie, Indiana. And I did not lead this project. It was a project that was led by Ball State University along with Recovery Cafe. Um, and what we found from this project is that storytellers have indicated that it helps them determine the best way to tell their story by working with a writing and listening partner. Through Recovery Cafe, members are often asked to go out into the community and share their testimonials of recovery. Some storytellers said, I didn't even know where to begin, right? My recovery journey was 20 years long. How do I even tell this story in a succinct way? And they found that working with a writing partner helped them capture a narrative that they now are able to go out and talk when they're sharing their testimonials in a succinct way about their story of recovery. Many members also shared about how healing it was to go through the process of recounting their story with a listener to get it on the page, and how they're really pleased how these stories are going to be used by Recovery Cafe for others who are facing recovery and are new to the program. Another example is Atlanta, Georgia did a project on sex and human trafficking, where men and women who had been trafficked as children, many of whom became sex workers, shared their stories of leaving sex trafficking, how they got out of that. And it was used as a source of healing again in the community with others who have faced sex trafficking. What's really interesting about this project is that they ended up partnering with the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport to record some of these stories. There became a kiosk that was available in the Delta domestic terminal. So travelers passing through could pick up headphones, listen to these stories that were collected, and pick up information on spotting human and sex trafficking while you're traveling. How do you report it without putting anybody at risk while you're doing that and such? So that was kind of an interesting project where they used the stories as a way to heal through telling their own narratives. But then there was a byproduct through action that created that kiosk piece at the Delta domestic terminal at the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. We did do a longitudinal study from 2016 to 2019 where we looked at participants from facing projects. We primarily focused on writers, those who were involved in theatrical events, and those who attended a community event, such as a listening circle, because we wanted to look at attitude change from those who maybe weren't directly facing whatever topic it may have been that a community adopted. We had about 7,500 participants who received this survey. We had 3,000 responses. It's about a 40% response rate. If you know anything about research and response rates, that's actually a pretty high response rate, so we're proud of that. When you look at attitude change from that, 80% have indicated that they're more likely to donate now to nonprofits facing the topic that was chosen in their community. 90% are now more likely to volunteer with those organizations. 91% indicated the model has challenged their previously held stereotypes, and 100% found it easier to understand the perspective of others after going through this process. So we're really proud of that because a part of our work is talking about empathy, right? We're wanting to move the needle on empathy to say, what is it about storytelling? What is it about using our own narratives in our communities to have these discussions can change hearts and minds? So to us, looking at this data, it proves to us that it can and it does. I now want to turn it over to my co-presenters to talk about their experience of leading facing projects, what it looked like in their community, and what some outcomes have been from their projects. And we'll turn it over to you, Lauren.
Great, thank you, JR. So I led the Facing Intolerance project that was run out of Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio in 2016. A little bit of background on the reason we chose this topic was that in 2011 in Springfield, there was a movement to add gender or sexuality and gender identity to the city's protected classes. It at the time was the largest city in Ohio that did not have gender identity and sexuality in their protected classes. And there was a movement to try to get it added in. However, it was shot down 2 to 3 by the city's council. I found that out as a freshman when I came to Wittenberg University in 2013, and was upset about learning about that. As a queer woman now living in that city, I was interested in getting more involved, but it took a couple years before I found a way to get involved in that activism. So in 2015, 2016, I was working at the community service office at our campus, and my supervisor came to me with this facing project proposal and said, Ohio Campus Compact is interested in funding facing projects throughout the state of Ohio. I thought you might be interested in this. At the time, I was getting a history degree and a minor in theater, and so the format was very exciting to me as a person who is interested in community work and activism and bringing like stories like that to the public in a theatrical or artistic way. I was very excited about that model. However, she brought it to me, I think, a day and a half before the application was due. So I immediately ran to my theater professor and got him on board to be our like faculty sponsor. The community service office was obviously in support of helping me on the project as well. And then the other thing I needed to find was a community partner. And I knew that we had a professor in our English department on campus who was a co-founder of Equality Springfield, which was the local LGBT activism organization. So I reached out to him. I'd never met him before and asked if we could meet that day. And he was so gracious to give me his time. And we talked through this project, and he was very excited about the idea and thought that Equality Springfield would be on board. So he went ahead and, co-signed that application, and we sent it in and got approved by Ohio Campus Compact. I also was able to apply for a grant on campus. The board members from Wittenberg, I think, all sponsor summer research projects. And so I was able to be funded to lead the project for the summer, to collect these stories and lead the team of writers. And Equality Springfield also was willing to donate a certain amount of money to help with the production of the books. At the time, the Facing Project Press was not created yet, so we had to figure out how to fund our production of our books, and they graciously chipped in. I worked with the Writing Center on campus to find writers. I also had many friends in the theater department who were on board to be writers and help us with the theatrical component of it. And then Equality Springfield did a lot of the work in finding us community members that we could interview and write their stories. I felt like this was a really good way to share these stories because at the time, the reason that the ordinance had been, well, the reason that was given for why the ordinance was not passed was because they said that discrimination against folks with varying genders or gender identities and sexualities didn't happen in Springfield. That wasn't a thing. They didn't need to protect against it because it wasn't happening. However, the Human Rights Committee had done intensive research and shown that that did in fact happen on multiple occasions that they can, document, and the city council still shot that down. So I felt like with sharing these stories and sharing these stories were centered on mostly folks' experiences within living within the city of Springfield. Some of them focus specifically on intolerance, some of them just about how they lived their lives in Springfield, that it would help show the city that there's a thriving community of queer individuals, and that there are many instances of intolerance happening in the city. So the outcome of our project was that we collected, I think, 18 stories from the community, and turn those into a book, which you can see the cover of here on the slide. And then I took those stories and crafted them into a 2-act theatrical performance. Our theater community on campus played the characters in the show. We had a student director, and we held a book launch event where this performance was performed, and community members could come and bring their families and friends to see their stories performed. That event was really powerful for me. My favorite part was watching the storytellers watch their stories be shared on stage. I think at this point, and as I say when I look back on this project, I think what the community really needed at this point was to feel seen and heard. They had just been shot down by the city and said, you know, your pain and your like stories don't matter. We don't see them. They don't happen here. You're not a valid member of this community that needs to be protected. And so it was really heartwarming to watch these storytellers feel like the community was listening to their story. After that event, we gave a large amount of the books that were printed to Equality Springfield, and they continued to use them to pass them out at different tabling events, Pride, and other events that happened in the city. And eventually in 2018, I believe, there was a turnover on the city council. One seat was up for election, and a new city council member got elected, and they almost immediately added the ordinance of sexuality and gender identity to their protected classes. It was interesting at that point, even though only one seat turned over, it was actually 4-1, which means one of the people who voted against it in 2011 actually joined and voted for it in 2018. So while I don't think that our project specifically, you know, changed the hearts and minds of the council members and that many folks in the community, I do think it reinvigorated the LGBT community to continue to fight for their rights. At the time, you know, I felt like the community was struggling with the loss that they had faced in 2011. And I think having these books and having people listen and having this kind of event really helped like embolden them to continue that fight. And eventually it did get passed. And then eventually, you know, a couple of years later, I think after that, it was passed at the national level that you were not allowed to discriminate on sexuality and gender identity in the workplace and housing at the national level. But this was a couple years before that. So those are the big outcomes from the project. And I know that these books are still circulating in Springfield. We do have a couple storytellers who have now passed away. So I know that their families and friends are very happy to have these books and the stories documented in them. Yeah, anything else, JR, that I missed that I should add in?
No, I think that's really great. And it was such a pleasure to work with you then, and of course now on the board and um, see the impact of this. One thing that I know you've mentioned to me before is what you did your grad work in.
Mhm.
And not that the Facing Project completely influenced you to do your graduate work in oral history, but you've mentioned before that it kind of did cement for you or help you determine that is. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely cemented my interest in combining history and like more public history facing work and community-based history. And so I pursued a master's degree in oral history, and continued documenting queer stories from the Midwest as my thesis. And I since then have worked for a storytelling nonprofit, as well as right now I work for Marquette University and run a local history project that's working on bringing local history into the curriculum for Milwaukee schools. So it definitely set me on the path, and I would definitely um, uh, I'm a strong like proponent of like getting this project into the hands of students. I think that it's a really great learning experience for a student. I was able to take on a leadership role. Our students on campus who are writers got to interact with the Springfield community in a brand new way. There is historically this Wittenberg bubble that everybody talks about in Springfield, where students on campus rarely go out into the community and get involved. And I think that through this project, we were able to get so many students on campus involved and understanding the different issues that were faced by the Springfield community, from our writers to some students were actually storytellers as well, and some students were from Springfield and also storytellers. And then our students who were involved in the theatrical production, I think that was really impactful for them. This is just a small anecdote, but one of our storytellers had not come out before our release of our book and our play. And she was bringing her family and friends to the play as like her outing. Um, and the student who played her in the show knew that information before the show, and she just was so I mean, she was so nervous to be the person who represented this story, but I think they understood at a deep level that they were representing the stories of people in the community, and took that very seriously. So I think it was an impactful experience for a lot of the students that were involved, and I definitely think getting students to focus on an issue that they care about on your campus is a great idea.
Mhm. I didn't know that about one of the
Yeah.
storytellers. That's new information for me. That's great though. Hopefully it went okay.
Yes, the only reason I found that out was because her grandson was in the theatrical production and found out through rehearsals that his grandmother was queer. So
Oh,
it
okay. I
was,
actually remember that story now.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you. Kathy, I'll pass it over to you.
So I had the opportunity to meet JR and Kelsey, the founders of the Facing Project, at a sociology conference. I'm a sociologist, and they had come to the conference to talk about a project they had done, I think with a professor at Ball State, but to also talk about the Facing Project. And when I first heard about it, I was like, oh, wow, I wish I could figure out how to do a Facing Project. And then unfortunately, I live in Dayton, Ohio. And in 2018, in the summer, we were the location of a mass shooting that happens to also be 2 streets from where I live. And you can see in the middle, it was at a bar. It says Dayton Strong. And unfortunately, the active shooter was a student at my college, and a couple of the victims were also students. So it was a very painful story. And as part of that, I happened to also work at the Peace Museum. So what ended up happening for this project, I sort of gave the idea to the Peace Museum, and this was all private donations. There were so many people in our community trying to look for a method of healing and a way to have dialogue about what had happened, that I was able to get enough private donations to make this project happen. And this one I'm not going to talk about as much, because unfortunately, the very week we were supposed to have training for writers and storytellers, the world shut down because of the pandemic. And luckily, I had a co-director helping with the project who happened to be chair of the English department. So we were both learning Zoom at the same time. And with a lot of her help, we were able to pull off the book during the pandemic. Almost all the stories and listening sessions were done virtually. And remember, nobody back then knew even how to do this. And we were able to, I think it's a really good book. It includes stories from some of the survivors at the Dayton mass shooting, but also just other gun violence stories. And I think one of the stories that I think is unique to that particular book is that one of the police officers who was first on the scene asked to tell his story. And to this day, he retired recently. He sent me the nicest note that of all the things he had done, just getting to have a voice and be able to talk about that experience was really powerful. We did have a small final event. Normally, when you do projects, you want to have a pretty large event and invite all the writers and storytellers. But this was still COVID, and we had an outdoor event where some of the folks that had told their stories came and retold their stories. And that event, while small attended, was actually attended by a lot of politicians. So a local Republican congressman came to that event, and later on he did vote in favor of some gun control policies at the federal level. The mayor of Dayton was involved in this project and helped write the foreword and actually helped me a lot with this project. She ended up running for governor of Ohio, and she actually did run on a very interesting gun control, was part of her platform. And she did reference this book. And I know she was part of the Facing Project podcast. And then another one of the survivors in the book actually just ran for state representative last year. So I think one of the interesting things that comes out of some of this is empowerment. And by just telling your story and hearing other people's stories, I think you also get a little angry when, especially when there's social justice, and it's like, I need to do something about this. So that ended up being, I think it's an interesting outcome of that project. And we do get a lot of requests at the Peace Museum for that book. One other thing we did, which was a little different, we invited artists to listen to the stories and also produce art. And still today at the Dayton International Peace Museum, by the way, that's the only peace museum in the whole United States, which is very sad. But there is a glass window that was made by a local artist to represent one of the stories in the book. And there's a story about that person and their story. And I was present when the family came and saw the exhibit, the art exhibit, and it's a very to this day, whenever I go see that window, it just reminds me of this project. So you can also add an art piece where local artists can come together and hear stories and create art. And I think that ended up being one of the stronger parts of the project. But this one was during the pandemic. So sometimes I try not to think about this one. So as much as I think it was such a good project, I think trying to do this during the pandemic was difficult. But I will say that I think lessons learned that there are ways to also do virtual projects. So depending on where you live and the community that you're in, I do think that there's experience now that having to do this virtually can work pretty well. But the second project is new, and we just finished it. If you want to, yeah, thank you. We just finished it in 2023, but it feels like yesterday. So after the first experience, I really wanted another experience, and I was able to write a grant and received funding to work on a project called Facing Eviction and Housing Insecurity. And again, Dayton, the mayor at the time, Nan Whaley, was still mayor. And the pandemic had just ended, sort of, and we knew that eviction was going to go up. And I had been doing research on eviction for about 8 years and engaging students. So one of the things I looked at that was a little bit differently about this project, I think the first project was really a community need. Community had come and said, hey, we really want to do something. This one was sort of a combination of me as a professor knowing I wanted to give my students an opportunity to do some research and and I really appreciate something JR said in the beginning, not just data analysis. My students do a lot of eviction court data analysis. We were looking for stories to sort of have a mixed methods approach. So I wanted to give my students experiences, but I was also serving on the eviction task force, and quite a community was developing around that. And I was also doing research with children. So this project, I think, had more of a traditional model. We had a steering committee, and all together, including all the children I interviewed for this project, I think there are about 50 stories and 50 voices in this book. And we were able to also, because of the grant I had a photographer from the New York Times come. She's a freelancer, and she helped take photographs. And as part of this project, we also produced a sort of a theatrical performance, more of a monologue. I think my favorite part was the little kids. We had children actually in the show. You can see sort of a picture of that. It was well attended. We had almost 150 people come from the community, and several students served as storytellers and also writers. And I think this book has had a lot of interesting impacts. So one thing, as a professor, my college has all the contracts for folks taking classes in incarcerated settings. And I teach a sociology class where they're supposed to be in the community. And unfortunately, folks in incarcerated settings can't do that. But I actually think and students write a lot about the opportunity to read this book. I get a lot of feedback from students, but this is required reading now for everybody that's incarcerated taking college classes in Ohio. And some of the feedback I've received from students, they just really appreciate the book. They talk about, and again, I think the empathy part's super important. They talk about sometimes how they forget that even though they have it pretty difficult and how hard it is to be in an incarcerated setting, that reading some of the stories also enable them to understand that there are other people struggling and that their struggles are different. And they also feel really strongly about the children part of the book, just, wishing they could do more. Some of them have talked about talking to their kids about the book and making sure they're helping the homeless in their community. And so I think that that's been a really positive. And again, I think Lauren talked about it and JR, and it happened just like the first book that I helped with in the community book. We've seen some political action come out of this. So there's quite a group of people in the community now. We have changed several policies in our community. We are now doing a right to counsel pilot project. We're one of the only communities in Ohio that now expunges eviction records, because that came out as the Scarlet E in this book. And one of the folks, I don't know that I've told you, JR, but one of the folks who helped tell a story in this book is now running for mayor of Dayton. So we seem to have a political connection when we do our projects. So we're really excited that one of the storytellers has decided to run for mayor. And another storyteller is actually, we now have a Dayton tenant union that came out of some of this work. So again, you can't always show the direct contact connection, but I think in this case, it's created quite a powerful community with a lot of people doing research. And then finally, I was able to use the research from this book and the experience to work on a documentary. So we just screened the documentary on Sunday. It's going national, and I was able to use this book and all the work that I had done to get seed money for a film made about eviction in our community. So it's been a really good experience, and I'm happy to say that a couple of the students that started off on this project, like Lauren, are in grad school now. And they are also doing social justice work and looking at degrees in social justice. So I just think all around it's a good experience, and it's really made a difference in our community. And just like Lauren, JR, is there anything you wanted me to say that I didn't?
No, that was great. And thank you for sharing some new updates. That's exciting to hear. Really great work all around. And much like I said to Lauren, it was such a joy to work with you. on both projects. And I often tell people selfishly, as someone who kind of started the beginning of this work and now it's grown way beyond just me and Kelsey, right? So many communities leading these projects, like both of you talked about. I selfishly get to learn about topics that maybe I thought I knew about, but once I read all of the stories, I learn even more. So I'm impacted every day by stories that are collected from facing projects, which has moved the needle on my own empathy when I thought that I understood, right, certain issues or topics where maybe I fully didn't. So thank you both for that. I'll quickly share, Mindy Levin and her colleague Steffi were unable to join us today, but their project is the newest one that's going to be hot off the presses. Their book, Facing Injustice in Health, comes out at the end of April. And this was a partnership among Johns Hopkins University, Source, which is the community engagement center at Johns Hopkins, and a nonprofit in Maryland, DC, and Delaware called Transform Mid-Atlantic, where they came together to look at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, primarily in the healthcare system in the Maryland area. And so they collected 17 stories on health and justice. And much like the projects that you heard today, they plan to use these stories in listening circles to have deeper discussions about how to move this conversation forward in their community and how these stories can help make a difference, not only for storytellers, but also for those who work in healthcare industries in Maryland around injustice that is in the healthcare system. I want to talk a bit about how we work with communities. I often say to people, I wish I could just do this for free and that we could do the work of the Facing Project without any support or income. But the truth is that there are expenses on our end around the toolkit that we provide, the trainings we provide, the book production that we provide. So there are 4 ways that we work with communities. I want to focus today on the first 2 columns, which is light and affiliate, because these are the most popular options we found that colleges and universities adopt when they do a facing project with their communities. The affiliate level is $7,500. That can be broken up into 3 payments to make it a little more digestible. What we provide is the toolkit, which is a 150-page training guide. It includes templates and it's designed as a workbook to help steering committees who are doing their facing projects put their projects together. As I mentioned earlier, we do a writer and storyteller training. So most of the time now I'm doing that via Zoom. So thank you, Kathy, as you mentioned before, with facing gun violence, we had never gone down that path of doing anything via Zoom with Facing Project. But you showed us through your project that it was possible for storytellers and writers to come together on Zoom. We've included that as a portion in our toolkit now, but it's also helped us be able to easily deliver our writer and storyteller trainings for our communities across the country. So part of the affiliate level, I'll do up to 2 trainings with projects where all of their storytellers and writers are trained on our writing process and listening process. We provide a year of coaching and consultation to the project as they're coming together. All stories that are collected or developed by the project come to us. We edit all of the stories, so we provide a content and a copy edit. And some people say a content edit, that's really strange. These are true stories. But we are, as a third-party eye, are able to watch for gaps in the story that maybe wouldn't make sense to others, that we point out areas where the storytelling teams can come back together to go a little deeper in the narratives. And then, of course, we do a copy editing because we move into book layout design and publishing for the Facing Project. And then 200 copies of the book are sent to the community to use to spread throughout their community to have these deep discussions. We also have what we call the Facing Project Light model, and this has been pretty popular with faculty who want to use the model as a way to get their students talking together, also to get their students working with a community partner, but they necessarily don't have the time or the capacity to move into the book production phase with us. This light level is often done in a semester-long project. They do receive the toolkit and a writer's training around this, We do edit the stories, but the stories then become available on our website, and then they can be used how the community chooses. But this is kind of a lighter way that can be done in a quicker way as well, that faculty have chosen to do in a semester. This too can also be broken up into a couple of payments. Um, People often say to me, how do people pay for their facing projects? You heard Lauren and Kathy talk about how they covered the cost in their communities. Grants are a popular way. So if you have an existing grant and there may be a way that this taps into that and you can use funds. We've seen nonprofits involved on projects pool funds together to help cover project costs. We've also seen, as Kathy mentioned before, private donations come in to help support this. But oftentimes it is multiple different pools of funding from the community coming together to support that. What's nice about it is that it includes more people who have a stake in the game, right? Who care about seeing the project come to fruition and have a dedication to sharing the stories out. What it also does is guarantee that they can get the stories and use the stories in a way in their own nonprofit organizations. I'm always open to having discussions about what that could look like in communities. So let's definitely talk about that if you're interested in doing a project. Because more than anything, we want to make this accessible for you. We want you to be able to do a project, and we don't want funding to be a barrier. But I always am upfront to say there are costs that happen on our end if you want to work through us to do a storytelling project. But we want to help you get there. We do ask that we can use the stories as well. So storytellers and writers retain their rights to their stories, but we do ask everyone to sign releases that allow us to publish the stories in a book that you then use to share in your community. We ask permission to post them on our website as well. We also ask permission that we can sometimes do what we call a single story, where we might share a story out on our social media to bring more attention to your project, but also to that story or topic. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a public radio show through Indiana Public Radio and the NPR network. So some stories from past facing projects are performed by voice actors. We might interview people from your community or others to talk about the project. So we do ask that we can use the stories in that way. To give you an idea about projects that are currently happening, these are what we have on our 2025 docket, and you can see there, they range from health and justice, as we talked about earlier, some other health stories around mind, body wellness, and dementia, all the way down to social justice and timely stories around resettlement and refugee and immigrant stories. But of course, we believe that any project, any story is important. We don't ever dictate what a community should face or focus on. So we do have an abstract process. And if you're watching this via YouTube, you will find the direct link to this abstract process in the description below. But we do ask a series of questions to help you make determinations on what might be an important topic to tackle in your community, to have conversations around. Have you thought about who the community partners might be? Have you thought about that inspire action piece? So beginning with the end in mind, what is it about the stories that you hope will change in your community? So we do have a short abstract process that gets you thinking about this, that you submit to us. We look at it as a team to make determinations on what we're able to take on. These are due on a rolling basis. We are looking right now to recruit projects to begin this summer and next fall. But if you have a project idea that you think, hey, I may not be able to start that until spring of 2026, that's okay. You can go ahead and start an abstract process to get the ball rolling. But this is how you access that. And this is how you connect with us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime. You can visit our website, facingproject.com, or email me directly at jr@facingproject.com. And of course, we always love when people follow us on social media. So you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Facing Project. Kathy or Lauren, any last things you would like to share?
No, just facing project's great. Everybody should do one.
Yeah, and I would also just say, you know, I'm at a community college, so funding sometimes seems difficult, but I really appreciated the Facing Project will work with you. And I have tried to do projects like this on my own in the past. And I have to say the toolkit and just the organization itself helps. And it's sort of a hard thing to say, but it's true that sometimes bringing in an outside organization that has such a high standard and they're publishing a book and they have a radio show can really excite and engage people in your community to get involved at a different level. So I just, I think it's really worth looking at and considering.
Mhm. One last thing that I'll add to about the radio show that has been appealing to folks is if we share some of the stories from your project in an episode and we interview you and or other experts around that topic, we'll send it directly to your local public radio station so that it can be broadcast. So in the instance of Kathy's projects, a couple of episodes have come out of those projects, which then the local NPR affiliate in Dayton did broadcast those episodes for listeners in the Dayton community. Well, thank you everyone for your time today and for taking a moment to listen to the work of the Facing Project, our origin story, examples of past projects, and how we work with communities. Again, we look forward to hearing from you, and please feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you.